man was dressed in black, his skin pale, his eyes dark and narrow, nose pointed. The most telling detail of all was the tattoo below his neck, a smiling face with crosses for eyes. Frank saw the man sitting at the park bench beneath the oak tree every morning when he went on his 8 o'clock walk. The man was always deeply focused, writing away in a leather-bound journal while the birds chirped over his head and the sun brightly shone over the park. Frank sometimes slowed his pace, risking disruption of his schedule, just to watch the man, finding him strangely absorbing. It wasn't until that morning in late May when Frank found the courage to walk up and talk to him. His courage was motivated by the man's action of capping his pen, placing it in the breast pocket of his black button-up shirt, and closing the journal in his lap. "Hello," Frank said. The man seemed not to hear him. He stared directly ahead, watching a group of kids throwing a frisbee on the expanse of grass. "Hi." Frank fidgeted his feet on the cobblestone path, a habit whenever he began to feel uncomfortable about something. The man looked up at him this time, a bemused look on his pale, thin face. He seemed to appraise Frank, looking him up and down, and then he said in a dull voice, "How can I help you?" "Well, I just see you often. I go walking through the park every morning, and you're always here, writing in that journal of yours. I guess I'm just curious about you. What are you writing about?" "You guess." The thin man crinkled his brow. The sun glare on his bald head was bright enough to make Frank squint a little. "Sorry? I didn't mean to bother you. I'll just—" Frank turned as if to walk away, but the man's unexpectedly commanding voice held him in place there on the path. "If you must know, sir, I'm a writer. My name is Charlie Royal, and I'm sitting here working on the rough draft of a new story. I'm not sure whether it will be a novel or a short story yet, but I have faith that it will become what it desires to become when that time arrives." Charlie lifted the journal, displaying it before Frank. His thin lips pressed together in a look of determination as if the binding of paper was heavy enough to get a good workout with. Then he set it on the empty side of the bench and crossed his legs and folded his hands over the top of one knee. "I've published 2 previous novels, both of them horror, supernatural fiction, or whatever useless category you want to box them into. The first was titled A Night to Remember. The second was called Full Moon Bathed in Blood." Frank nodded, smiling, both hands stuffed in the front pockets of his jeans while he scuffed his shoes over the cobblestones below him. "Well, that's swell," Frank said. The writer's frown indicated he had heard that turn of phrase. "I've never read either of your books. Of course, I've never been too much of a horror fan." Now the writer smiled thinly, the cynical smile of a man who had heard that line before. "Let me guess." Charlie cleared his throat with an air of haughtiness before he carried on. "You don't read horror because you just can't understand why someone would want to dream about horrible things with so many horrible things happening in real life." Frank felt put in his place. "I think you described it better than I ever could. That's right. It disturbs me that people would want to dwell on horrible things. Why would someone want to feel scared? Isn't feeling scared a bad thing? Don't we want to feel confident and calm?" Charlie snickered a little, wiggling his fingers, and it was then that Frank noticed the big turquoise ring and felt surprised he had missed it earlier. "Well, reading horror makes me feel confident and calm." When he pronounced the word "me," he gestured his hands toward himself and folded them over his knee once again. "Reading and writing about fictional horrors helps me to cope with the real horrors." Frank sensed the writer perceived him as a stupid child, although Frank didn't feel offended in any way. The whole moment was just surreal. The simple greeting he made to the stranger had immediately turned into an argument about the merits of horror fiction. Not what he had in mind, but he supposed he would take it with the hope that their conversation could progress to something else. "Sure, makes sense," Frank said, although none of it made sense in his mind at all. "Did you grow up here?" Charlie uncrossed his legs and folded his arms, sighing. "No, I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Seattle, but I just needed the geographical change to spark my imagination. I've had writer's block over the past year. One morning I just pulled out a map and randomly placed my finger on a place, and that place happened to be this small community of One Horse, Nevada. So are you writing a book about this town? Charlie raised his eyebrows, smiling. If I was, would that upset you? Frank smiled in return. He could tell this was the moment he was breaking through a barrier. That depends on what you have to say about our town. The smile slackened to a thoughtful look on Charlie's face. Well, I'm not sure yet whether what I will say will be good or bad, but for sure there will be some element of horror in it. You don't mind telling me what you've written so far, do you? Charlie placed his hand over the black leather cover of the journal. Then he looked up at Frank. Not yet. Right now the story's too fragile, if you catch my drift. I don't fully know what the story's about, but I'll tell you what. When I finish it, I'll let you read it, and you can tell me what you think. How does that sound? Frank felt uneasy, considering his inferiority to Charlie in the realm of writing. What did he have to say about this man and his work? That sounds interesting, Frank said. Great. Well, you know where to find me when I do complete the story. Charlie waved and smiled at Frank before he reopened the journal to begin writing again. Yes, I do. Frank waved in return, and then slowly carried on with his walk. Nice meeting you. Charlie was no longer paying attention. The man was already deep in his journal, writing away. For the next 2 weeks, Frank carried on with his daily routines as he waited for Charlie to finish his story. He waited with feelings of anticipation and excitement towards something new, but beneath those emotions, lingering like a steady but mild tremor, was a feeling of uneasy uncertainty. He was a 6th grade teacher, which meant he understood many of the basics about essay writing and grammatical structure, but when it came to understanding the criteria for horror fiction, Frank was a stranger in a strange land. In order to prepare, Frank added an activity to his summer vacation daily schedule. The evenings were spent reading horror fiction, hoping to still himself over time the way a blister will become a callus. Arranged in untidy piles on his desk were various paperbacks by Stephen King, Clive Barker, and Peter Straub. He also acquired 2 behemoth short story collections containing varieties of horror from classics like Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft to more modern authors such as Ramsey Campbell and Evan Hunter. All of these books he obtained at the library. He tried to find Charlie's previously published novels, but none could be found. At first he read them at random, reading a chapter here and there from each of them. This was him flirting with the idea, unsure where to start or how to approach something that seemed so alien and strange to him. It was the short story collections that pulled him in fully, because they horrified him in small doses and provided that random process he felt more comfortable with from the start. New sets of emotions grew inside him as he deepened his reading into the nights. The surface emotions, the most powerful ones, were feelings of paranoia and nausea, but underneath was something compelling, an emotion he didn't fully understand. He couldn't stop reading them despite how nauseous they made him feel. Morbid fascination were the 2 words that frequently popped up in his mind when he tried to explain to himself why he felt so compelled to keep reading stories about lurid interdimensional monsters, serial killers, vampires, werewolves, and other hideous things of mysterious origin and no name. Good heavens, I'm surprised this Charlie Royal isn't suicidal, Frank said one afternoon when he finished reading the last sentence of Stephen King's Pet Sematary. His wife, Elena, glanced up to him briefly. She was entranced by the crossword puzzle she'd been working on. I thought you planned on just reading that stuff at night. Well, I was almost finished with this one, so I figured what the heck. He gazed at the cover for a moment, meditating on the horrible ending of that cold, dead hand touching Louis Crete's shoulder and shivered at the thought of it. Yet you liked it too, didn't you, Frank? Yes, you did. It gave you a thrill down deep. The strangeness of it. The spectacle. He shut the thought away, shaking his head as he did. The thought was true. He did like it because despite how awful the whole situation was, there was something beautiful about it too. Some kind of aesthetic value that spoke to him in a profound way. He looked to his wife, who leaned back with the crossword section of the paper in her lap. She pursed her lips and tapped the eraser end of the pencil on the paper as she tried to decipher a new word. So many of these books end with such horrible situations. Characters dying, people going insane. All these characters have to suffer such great cost. Cost that would be hard to bear. It's so much. It's so much like... Frank couldn't think of the word. He set the book down on the ground and scratched his head in thought. Elena found the words for him. Real life? Yes, exactly. In real life, so often we deal with horrible things like death, war, illness, freak accidents, murder, and whatever awful thing there is. People really suffer insanity. Remember that Burgess woman who used to live in the house the Gardners live in? Gloria. Elena never looked up from her crossword. Yeah, Gloria. She went crazy, remember? She believed the government had tapped into her mind through her cell phone and was stilling her thoughts, and she irrationally started removing the doors from all the rooms of her house. That kind of stuff is in these books I'm reading about. Just strange and horrible stuff. Why do people want to dwell on this when so much of it is going on in real life? Why do you keep reading it, Frank? Elena scrawled in the letters of a new word. Because I'm trying to find the answer. I'm trying to understand why. I don't know. Elena set the pencil down and looked up at Frank. Maybe he writes and reads about such stuff because he's trying to answer certain questions for himself. At first, such an answer seemed so obvious that Frank wanted to dismiss it. Then it clicked with something else Charlie said during that morning when they had been talking in the park for the first time. Charlie told him that writing and reading about horrors made him feel calmer, as if something about such stories comforted him, a release of some sort. That still didn't make complete sense. Frank felt the complete opposite when he read horror stories. Could Elena be right to some extent? Did horror fiction answer certain questions for Charlie, thus comforting him in some way? What questions? Questions about the junk you were going on about earlier. Death and madness and all that. A release of some sort. He had heard the term before. Catharsis. Such an idea had always seemed like woolly-headed bullshit. A pretentious explanation for horror fiction that really held no practical basis. Yet perhaps he had been looking at it in the wrong way. Later that night, Frank stood at the bedroom window and gazed out at the dark neighborhood beyond. He thought about Charlie. He imagined the man sitting on some motel bed, possibly watching late-night TV. But most likely Charlie was reading some horror book and genuinely enjoying it. Frank imagined the man grinning from ear to ear as he read a detailed account of some hideous monster decimating a city and tearing the limbs off people, slowly and painfully. Perhaps tomorrow his book will be finished. Then I can get it over with, the last horror story I ever read. That night Frank dreamed he saw Charlie in the park, only Charlie was not the normal Charlie. His body was limp, like a fallen rag doll. The skin on his body was peeling away like rotted wallpaper. Spiders, huge black ones with numerous red eyes, crawled out from his body and hissed and squealed as they chased after Frank. He tried to run, but the dream wouldn't allow him. The spider swarmed his body and weighed him down to the ground in stinging pain. Rain drizzled off and on the next morning when Frank took his walk. Normally he would see mothers pushing children in strollers on the cobblestone path and teenagers playing frisbee or football in the field. So far he hadn't seen anyone. It was a surprise when he saw Charlie Royal sitting at the bench with the rain sprinkling upon him. Charlie sat up straight when he noticed Frank walking towards him. For a brief moment Frank imagined his dream, Charlie limp like a puppet, flesh tearing away, and spiders swarming after him. Charlie looked robust that morning, a content little smile on his face as Frank walked towards him. The journal, wrapped in a plastic bag, sat in his lap. "Good morning," Charlie said. "Hello. Call me crazy, but I get the feeling you finished the story." "Oh, you're crazy all right." Charlie snorted laughter. "I did." Charlie wore the same black outfit that he wore the first day Frank had met him. It almost seemed poetic, a sense of coming full circle. "Well, you ready for it?" Charlie's narrow dark eyes widened, and they reminded Frank of black holes, as if the man had no soul inside his body. "Just your new morbid imagination talking, Frank. Take it easy." "As ready as I can be, I suppose. I spent some time reading other works in your field, in an attempt to prepare myself." "Good. What did you read? How did you like it?" "I read Poe, Lovecraft, King, Barker, Straub, and a bunch of others and a few short story collections. I'm not sure what I think of it. To be honest, I feel pretty morose. Such stories cast a shadow over the day for me. But at the same time, I couldn't get enough of them. Charlie chuckled. Just like junk food, isn't it? He tilted his head, grinning. Frank was surprised by how straight and white his teeth were. They almost looked like a model set of teeth one might find displayed in a dentist's office. I guess just some of us like to bask in the shadows, don't we? Charlie glanced across the field of grass where a young couple was sitting under a pair of elm trees, hugging and kissing. The grin eased to a thoughtful expression. A dark and foreboding feeling came over Frank. He chose to ignore it. This man who called himself a horror writer was really just a normal guy. Frank knew that. Sometimes such writers got reputations as creepy people. For instance, a horror writer might be a Satan worshiper or a serial killer on his free time. But Frank was intelligent enough to realize that most of that was just paranoia. Reputation isn't character. Reputation is just what people think you are, just as I think and feel that Mr. Charlie Royal here wants to hurt me with that book of his. But that's just my imagination. This guy's just doing what they pay him to do. He's creating effect, and he's doing a damned good job of it. Charlie lifted the journal up to Frank, and Frank took it. The plastic bag wrapped around it crinkled between his fingers. The book felt heavy in his hands, heavier than he thought it should feel, almost as if the actual ink on the pages had added weight to the book. I hope this one casts a shadow, Charlie said, grinning with wide eyes again. A long shadow. I want this one to cast a shadow over your whole month. Knowing me, it probably will. I'll give you a round of applause for that effect again, Mr. Charlie Royal, Frank thought. And oh my, will those wide and dark black holes you have for eyes suck me in if I stand here too long? Dark clouds spread like shadowy fingers gripping the sky overhead. Thunder boomed and Frank visibly jumped. They parted during that moment, Frank walking in one direction and Charlie in the opposite. The rain began to pour following the clap of thunder, and Frank watched the young couple jump to their feet and run to the truck parked on the curbside. Charlie Royal's entitled novel consumed nearly every minute of Frank's day. Whenever he planned in his rigorous schedule, it had been consumed by it. He read the first 50 pages as soon as he got home, sitting on the living room couch with his fat house cat Wanda crawling about under his feet, brushing her soft, furry body against his calves. A cup of lemonade sat by his side, which he took a sip out of after every 4 pages. Meanwhile, Ellen had dusted shelves throughout the living room and wiped down counters in the kitchen. At one point she had the vacuum going in one of the upstairs rooms. Frank was oblivious to it all. His mind was in a completely different world. Charlie was a good writer. Frank could admit that right off the bat. The narrative was engaging, the characters well developed, and Frank felt sympathetic for the young boy Wesley and the horrible temptation his father, Donovan, had put upon him. The story took place in the mid-19th century in a fictionalized version of his own hometown. A strange demon haunted the village of One Horse for years, residing in the desert beyond. Frank didn't know completely what was coming up for Wesley after the first 50 pages, but he was getting some ideas. Sometimes, late at night, the boy would wake up unable to move or speak, and a black shape would be standing over his bed, speaking ominous words to him while he lay there helpless. The darkness lives in you. The darkness moves you. Years passed. Now Wesley was a young man of 17, and his father had a secret to reveal to him. A secret in the desert. Frank marked his place by folding the corner of the page and set the journal aside. He gulped down the rest of his lemonade. Wanda brushed his ankles, so he reached down and petted her. He got up and wandered about the living room, contemplating what he had just read. Now it will be Wesley's turn, Frank thought. He watched rain spatter and course down the window, blurring the view of the dark green lawn in the backyard. Now his father will introduce him to the demon, and his fate will be the same as the rest of them. Their souls will be sold to it, and darkness will rule the rest of his life. A cold, awful feeling grew in Frank's chest as he meditated on the idea. It felt like an icy hand slipping its fingers over his heart, preparing to squeeze. He thought about Charlie, who seemed to glow with pleasure at what he had written. It seemed so obscene to Frank in that moment, but he had to admit, the story was effective. He truly desired to find out what would happen to Wesley and his father. No, not just a desire. He needed to know. He felt a hunger to know. So he prepared more lemonade and sat down to read another 50 pages. 50 pages turned into 80, and he was 3/4 of the way through the story. He ignored his wife's mild protest for him to put the stupid thing down. At this point, Frank knew what was coming in the end, and he noticed this characteristic in other horror novels he had read. Wesley wouldn't escape the chains bound to his soul, but that didn't lessen the horror and suspense Frank felt, because he cared for Wesley, and he was heartbroken to see that suffering and doom awaited him. But, of course, there was still that part of Frank that hoped for a different fate, which was the truth when we faced real horrors in life that we knew were coming. Despite our inside knowledge of the coming despair, we still hoped for something different. We still closed our eyes and prayed as we felt the monster's acrid breath on our faces. "Frank, give me a break, will you, and close that stupid thing so you can eat something? For Pete's sake." Frank obeyed his wife, marking the page and setting the journal on the coffee table before him. Wanda suddenly leaped up on top of the book and gazed at Frank with her gleaming green eyes and meowed at him. Frank gazed at his cat, feeling stupefied. It's almost as if she doesn't want me to read any more of it. That meow almost sounded like a scolding. "Frank," his wife scolded, I'm coming. He got up and joined her at the kitchen table. He didn't feel like eating. He couldn't get thoughts of descriptions of grisly, ritualistic murders out of his mind. Wesley and Donovan were stuck in a cycle of ritualistic murder as acts of devotion to the demon. Worst of all was the image of the demon itself. It lived in a dark cave, and it was something so hideous and evil that their bodies, overwhelmed by the demon's presence, collapsed, trembling and ill. Frank noticed his wife gazing at him while he picked at his green beans. She displayed that same scolding look that Wanda expressed, only she was much more beautiful with a curl of blonde hair draped over the corner of one eye. She brushed it aside before she spoke. "Frank?" He looked at her expectantly. "I don't like you reading that stuff. You're not the same." "Oh, Elena, I'm fine. It's just a stupid story." He set the fork down and brushed a napkin over his scowling face. "I agree, it's not the best stuff to read. I don't plan to read any more of it, but come on, don't give me this nonsense about how I'm not the same. What? Do you believe I'm changing into a vampire?" He laughed. Elena didn't even smile. "But it is changing you," Frank thought. "You haven't felt so good these past couple of days. Remember that feeling you get, deep in your chest? That feeling of cold hands gripping your heart?" "Okay, fine, a stupid joke," Frank said. "But I'm really fine, Elena. I promise. As soon as I'm finished reading this story, no more." He tried to smile at her as a gesture of assurance, but she didn't smile back. They spent the next few moments eating in silence, and then they both went up to bed. Frank was lost in a cave. Darkness enshrouded him. He reached out to feel jagged rock on all sides, although a slimy, wriggling substance oozed between his fingers in some areas. Far ahead of him was a sliver of white light that resembled the slit of moon one saw in the night sky around the middle of the month. Frank knew the sliver of light was the way out. Behind him, down deep in the depths of the cave, resounded heavy rumbling noises. Accompanying these noises was a high-pitched buzzing howl, grating to his ears. There was also a menacing quality to that sound. Frank could hear deep rage in it, an insane rage. He tried to move toward the sliver of light, but his legs wouldn't work. They felt heavy, lethargic, and almost as if they were melting into the ground. He strained every bit of his strength to come unto it, but it still seemed so far away and unreachable. The rumbling movements grew louder. Frank could feel the curves of the rock beneath his hands vibrating. A rotten and sulfuric smell emerged from the dark depths. There was also a faint, spicy smell of decomposition. Panic electrified his nerves as stinging pain sparked around his wrists and ankles. Something scaly and rough cut into them, squeezing and pulling. He collapsed to the hard, rocky ground and screamed as he was dragged along the rock floor toward a hideous alien face glowing with numerous eyes. Frank felt hatred and insanity emanating from those eyes. The high-pitched howl resounded, and the rotten stench of death and despair blasted into him. Frank awoke from his nightmare with such intensity that it caused him to stumble out of bed. Elena awoke that moment, gasping and nearly knocking over the lamp as she reached to switch it on. "Frank, what happened? Are you all right?" It took him a moment to collect himself. He still felt like he might be lost in that dark cave. He kept rubbing his hands over his legs, feeling for the tentacles. "Yes, hon, I'm fine." He got back to his feet and climbed into bed and leaned over and kissed her forehead. She was still gazing at him with a stunned expression, her eyes nearly bulging and her mouth agape. "I would like to reassure you that this is the last horror story I ever read." After a few moments of silence, Elena said, "I hope so, for the sake of both of us." He reached over to hug and kiss her again, but she turned away and switched off the lamp. He lay beside her, one hand pressed gently against her back, feeling it expand with air and lower as she inhaled and exhaled. He thought about the dream. He hoped he was right, that everything would be okay, but he couldn't help that icy cold feeling agitating his chest, seeming to say the opposite, that everything would go wrong. After several minutes, he drifted to sleep. This time his sleep was dreamless. After breakfast the next morning, Frank sat down in the living room and finished Charlie's story. Again it was intensely absorbing. He paid no attention to the sounds of his wife's activities throughout the house, although there were a few moments when Frank jumped at the fill of his cap brushing his ankles, thinking it might just be the tentacles of that cave demon. The final quarter of the novel spiraled down into a pitch-black hole as dark and despairing as its author's soulless dark eyes. Wesley followed murder after murder, decimating the village, all done in the name of some nameless evil. The ending portrayed their suicide, father and son blowing each other's brains out simultaneously. Charlie made sure that there were no redeeming qualities in the end by providing a detailed description of their twitching dead bodies with blood oozing from the head wounds. Frank nearly vomited by the time he turned the last page. The page seemed to feel heavier than all the rest. "I'm done," he said in a trembling voice. "Thank God, I'm done, and I'm never reading another horror novel again." He didn't waste any time trying to return the novel to its author. He walked to the park later that afternoon. He didn't plan to say much to Mr. Royal about his story, other than the man had talent, but it was wasted talent on bleak garbage like what he was carrying in his hand. Frank faced a problem when he arrived at the bench where Charlie normally sat. The man was nowhere to be found. There were plenty of others at the park that day, kids playing football in the field, a couple of mothers strolling by pushing children in their strollers. Frank waited at the park bench for a couple hours, but Charlie never showed up, so he returned home, head hanging low, and his hand feeling dirty from carrying the leather-bound monstrosity. He hoped the gloom would pass since he finished reading the story, but it didn't. It actually seemed to intensify the more he felt compelled to ruminate about it. He fell back into his old routine of sitting on the porch with Elena. She did a crossword puzzle and he read the news, only he wasn't really reading it. Instead his mind rehashed certain passages and images from Charlie's novel, and it felt like a sharp icicle was jabbed into his heart. The shadow of a black cloud lingered over his day, and Frank felt sure that Charlie was right. It would linger for quite some time before it dissipated. Elena continually glanced at him as he sat there shifting the newspaper in his hands, her worried gaze searching him, trying to understand what was going on inside him. "Can you loosen up a little now? You finished, right? You don't have to read that crap anymore. Let it go." She smiled, attempting to be humorous, but Frank could tell by the way her lips slightly trembled that the smile was forced. "I'm trying." "Why don't you just throw the stupid book away, Frank? The reason you're not feeling better is because it's still around, calling you to read it. If you just threw it away, you'd forget about it." "Calling me, eh?" Frank thought. "I thought it was just a stupid book, an inanimate object, but you make it sound sentient and evil, my dear, lovely wife. I'm sorry, but when you talk that way, you're not helping." "I can't do that," Frank said. "It's not mine." "Well, it's his fault that he didn't show up to get it. Too bad for him. I'm sure he'll be there tomorrow morning. I just missed him." They fell silent. Elena scribbled in a new word on the crossword and Frank eyed the newspaper. All the columns of words looked dizzying to him. His head began to spin and he felt like he was going to vomit. He decided to get up and go inside to watch some TV for a change. There was some golf he'd missed over the past couple weeks. Images of a little white ball soaring into blue sky and landing on flat green grass became quite soothing. It wasn't longer than 30 minutes before Frank's eyelids became heavier with drowsiness. The cold, tense feeling in his chest began to thaw and loosen as well. As he drifted into the darkness of sleep, a brief flash of hope sparked inside him, and then all was darkness. Jagged rock walls closed around him like so many teeth of a giant beast. The sliver of white light was the goal. It was the prize he was trying to reach. He tried to run towards it, but his legs felt like rubber melting into the ground below him. Behind him held the mystery, the terror concealed in the darkness. The rumbling vibrations of its massive movements grew louder and more intense. The sound of its buzzing insect-like howl grew louder. The smell of decomposition assaulted Frank's nostrils. He reached for the light with all his might and strength, but it was of no use. Soon the tentacles latched around his wrists and ankles, the scales biting into his flesh. Frank screamed as they pulled him toward the source of that buzzing howl and before those hundreds of eyes that stared on him with hatred and insanity. This time something different happened. He didn't wake up just before he reached that howling maw. This time the tentacles jammed him feet first into it, and pain, like a spark of fire, roared through his body. Frank screamed and screamed as he was slowly swallowed by it. Elena heard a hard thud inside the house and was immediately alarmed by it. She set aside the crossword and went inside the house. Adrenaline jolted through her the moment she saw Frank's hand lying on the ground, just in view, poking out from the corner of the couch. She hurried over to him. "Frank!" The rest of him was revealed on the other side of the couch. He lay on the ground, the other arm sprawled over his head. Meanwhile, a golf tournament calmly played on from the TV. "Frank, can you hear me?" She started to sob as she caressed his head and cheeks. Nothing she did revived him. He remained unconscious and limp. She hurried to the kitchen where her phone sat on the countertop by the sink and called an ambulance. The next 5 minutes she knelt over his body waiting, while the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Natural causes was the best answer the coroner's examination could come up with, which really meant they didn't have a clue what killed Frank Moore that June mid-afternoon. His funeral was well attended. Frank was well loved by the children he taught as well as the parents of those children. Elena sat in the front row during the eulogy, which was given by her son, Albert. She sobbed through the entire process, and by the time his grave was lowered and the graveside prayer given, she felt like blood might start flowing right along with her tears. Albert guided her back to the car when the funeral services were all said and done. A man dressed in black stood under a tree nearby the parked car. There was a tattoo on his chest of a smiley face with crosses for eyes. As Elena and her son walked by, she eyed this stranger and he eyed her back, smiling as he did, a thin smile that made the dark eyes seem to gleam. She felt a cold chill run through her at that moment. There was something awful in the way that man's eyes looked when he smiled. She sensed something malevolent in them. 1 year passed. Ellen had decided to move from her house in One Horse, Nevada to a small community in Utah called Judson, the place where Albert and his wife lived. Her son and his wife helped her load everything up in the U-Haul trucks, and the whole process was bittersweet. She missed what she was leaving, 30 years of memories with the man she loved, but she was also excited to watch her son mature with a family of his own. She couldn't sleep that first night in her new home. Her mind circulated with thoughts about unpacking all those boxes, memories she left behind, and the fear of what might lay ahead. She tossed and turned in bed, occasionally dozing off into a light sleep only to awaken again. Push came to shove, and she made herself get up and go downstairs to the living room where most of the boxes were. She planned to unpack some things for an hour or so. Perhaps that would ease her mind for sleep. She pulled up a chair next to one of the boxes and opened it. What she saw inside caused her stomach to clench. The leather-bound journal Frank had been reading when he died lay on top of the pile of other books. Many of them were those other horror books he'd been reading with it. She picked up the leather-bound journal and was surprised how heavy it felt. Maybe all that ink is added weight, she thought. She placed the journal in her lap and wondered. I never liked the fact that he was reading this thing. It made him feel so gloomy. All that horror junk made him gloomy. Yet this made him feel worse than the rest. I wonder if... She closed that thought away before it could be articulated. The idea that a piece of writing could cause a person's death was crazy. It sounded like something that would be written about in a ridiculous horror story. The curiosity got the better of her that night. She opened the first page, telling herself that she could handle it. She had always been a little tougher than Frank. Besides, she could always just stop reading if she felt it got too intense. A thrilling, strange horror story sounded kind of interesting. A way to get her mind off the real horror of losing her husband. Helena read the first 2 passages aloud in the quiet room of her new house. Wesley, a young boy of 8 years, awoke with a gasp from a nightmare that had gripped his sleep for the past week. In this dream, the boy found himself lost in a dark cave while a mysterious beast followed him in the dark depths, with what seemed to Wesley brutal intentions. That was all it took. Helena was hooked.